Welcome, everyone. It is my great pleasure to open this webinar dedicated to the World Water Day 2024. Thank you for being with us. At this point, we have exactly 100 registered participants coming from 35 different countries. So very nice diversity of our listeners. And my name is Paweł Jarosiewicz, and I serve as the president of the IAHR Young Professional Network in Poland. With the team, we organized today meeting to celebrate this important day for all water enthusiasts. The best way to celebrate, we believe, is to get new knowledge, is to learn, is to think bigger. And this year theme of World Water Development Report is related to water and its connection with peace and prosperity. Therefore, we decided to invite two exceptional speakers coming from very different locations to share their perspective with us on this topic. And today we have with us Andrew Allan from UNESCO Center for Water Law, Policy and Science from University of Dundee, Scotland, and also Wakjira Takala Dibaba from Jimma Institute of Technology in Ethiopia. So I am very glad that we have both of you together with us. But before we start this major part of our meeting, my duty here is also to encourage you all to read the report. And therefore, I will go quickly through the report now with you. So what you can find inside. A lot of important information, including this, that worldwide agriculture accounts for roughly 70% of freshwater withdrawals, followed by industry, which is just under 20%, and domestic use. However, these figures vary considerably as a function of a country level of economic development, with higher income countries using more water for industry, when lower income countries use even 90% of water for agriculture irrigation. So this is one of the elements covered by the report. The other are the very interesting statistics related even to the global distribution of water, as you can see here, the water stress. In general, I counted in the report that I have here also the printed version with me. In the report, you will find 28 figures on water resources, and I find all of them very interesting, and I believe you will find too. And the things that also were addressed are related to water and deployment. And this is very interesting data showing that, for example, 50% of jobs in high-income countries depend on water. And this figure goes to 80% when we talk about lowest income countries. And one of the sentences, one of the reference cited there is telling that agriculture is the largest employer of the world's poor, which I believe is the message that we should all take under consideration. There are several thematic focuses in this report, starting with food and agriculture, then going through human settlements and all the inequalities related to the access to water resources and sanitation services. There is also industry and its role in water quality and availability. There is energy sector, largely covered with new data, important information. My favorite one, which is related to ecosystems, which is also there. And there are some suggestions, there are some response options that authors of the report proposed in the final chapters. They are referring to the governance and transborder cooperation that I believe we will also hear a little bit more in our meeting today. There is also a strong pressure on science, technology, and information. For instance, this figure is about the global distribution of river gouging stations on our rivers. And the authors underline that in recent years, there is no progress in development of new stations, which is, of course, an important issue related to the data access, data availability, for improvement of our water resources management. And there is a chapter related to education and capacity development. And last but not least, for sure, the financing, very important issue related to water resources. And here I want to share with you only one figure from the report showing data on private sector, where it's already clearly visible that the cost of mitigation is only fraction of the potential water-related impact that private industry can observe in the following years. And as authors underlined, better understanding of water-related risks can make financial actors engage to invest in mitigation those risks. And there are several takeaway messages that I would like to share with you also, like appreciation for local and traditional knowledge and stakeholder involvement in growing. Benefit sharing is central to equitable water allocation and governance. Transboundary cooperation strengthens regional integration, and investing in water delivers multiple social, economic, and environmental co-benefits. And I would like I would like to add one element from myself, that those ideas and perspectives on sustainable water resources management must be advocated among different stakeholders, and priority should be given to youth that will continue this mission in future. And in this framework, I am extremely happy to share with you great information that the capacity development and water family coordination section of the Intergovernmental Hydrological Program, UNESCO IHP, will launch the Ecohydrology Youth Network that will focus on global youth engagement in ecohydrology and nature-based solutions for water management. In the following days, I will be glad to share with you, with all the participants, the invitation with all details about this network. So please stay tuned. Soon you will receive more detailed information on that new network that we are now building. And now, finally, we are moving to our major event, so to our speakers. Without further time consumption, I would like to give this online time, so give the screen to Andrew Allan from the UNESCO Center for Water Law Policy and Science. Please, Allan, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Pavel. I'm going to try to share my screen, see if this works. Trying to make sure I get the right screen.
Yeah, okay.
Oh.
It's there, but you can go to the full scale.
Does that work, or you're seeing no notes? Hang on a second.
Yeah, we see no notes.
Sorry, this is always more complicated than it needs to be. How's that?
Yes, now it's perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Pavel, and thank you for the additional information about the report. That's really interesting, and I think I'll refer to some of the points that you've already raised this morning. The first thing to say is I'm a lawyer by background, and so probably not a natural member of this group, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak a bit about the law, because from the perspective of Water for Peace, I think it's important. Now, I should also say that my focus is on the legal frameworks for water resource management, so water resource management at the national level primarily. So I will talk about the international level, But I think for peace and the idea of conflict prevention, etc., is very, very wide. There's a great report that's produced, was produced recently and used to be produced annually, I think, the conflict database that the Pacific Institute in different kinds of ways in which water can be involved in conflict and can be involved in the promotion of peace. As you'll see from the rest of the presentation, I'm going to try and not deal with everything, but I'll try and keep it, first of all, relevant to national legal frameworks, and hopefully we'll be able to keep to time. If you, Pablo, if you can keep me to time, I'll out of it. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the idea that I think understood by people as only relating to international conflicts, so conflicts between different countries over shared waters. That is true to some extent, although if you try to find conflicts between actual armed conflicts between countries, over I like to talk about never to encourage that. They always want to try and reduce the chances of that happening. But from my perspective, and what I think you can see from global databases on this is that actually most conflict over water, so from my perspective, that national focus that I have, over the course of my work over the last kind of 20 years or so, I've seen the way that water governance frameworks can work at the national level and also what makes them not work. So I'll talk a bit more, I'll say now, I suppose, that when I talk about governance frameworks as opposed to law, some can be a bit confusing for non-lawyers. The definition changes. Secondly, policy, and then thirdly, the institutional side. So the way that water resource management is Dutch ministries, which agencies. That's what I'm going to try and talk about, because these are all the extent can contribute to make it more difficult to achieve that. So the next thing I want to do is to kind of set the boundaries. I'm not going to talk about the kind of thing that we've heard in the news in recent years, where water has been weaponized, whether it's the bombing of the dam in Ukraine, whether it's the bombing of water delivery distribution points in Gaza, etc. There's a lot going on where water is relevant to conflict and lack of peace. But I want to try and kind of limit it a bit. So I mentioned here a number of different ways in which conflict can be generated. Firstly, I mentioned transboundary waters here, so this is a bit more detail later on. But the idea that if countries cannot agree on the management of shared transboundary resources, that is potentially an area for conflict to arise. As I mentioned, actually examples of states going to war with each other for water is thankfully relatively limited. But I want to try and flag up to you the idea that even if a basin agreement exists So we've got kind of principles of international law, and we may have basin agreements on individual rivers. To a very large extent, in order for those to work, they need to have national frameworks which can implement them. Okay, so national frameworks for water resource management generally, the alignment of those with international frameworks is often not very good. Partly because the processes are separate. So what would happen at the national level for water might be separate from what's happening at the kind of foreign affairs side of things, where things are agreed, and then the ability of national legal frameworks to deal with them is a bit more uncertain. And so these kind of conflicts come up as a result of a number of different reasons. So first of all, scarcity and availability. If you look at the kind of things that have been happening, leaving aside what I mentioned earlier about the existing conflict situation, where there's scarcity and where there is problems with availability, that can create flashpoints, for example, between different ethnic groups or between different sectoral users, which we'll come back to. Pavel's already mentioned a number of them. Number of the key ones, I think, probably agriculture, energy, domestic use, and increasing industrial use of water. And then finally, also what you might call the more silent interests, primarily the environment. Secondly, we've got problems with distribution and timing, so the way that water is distributed and when, especially for agriculture, when that water is available. All of these are within the remit of national legal frameworks, and the quality of the national legal framework, if it's a high quality one, then hopefully issues about scarcity, distribution, etc., will be dealt with and quite clearly addressed. The second aspect, from leaving aside the kind of the quantitative side, is the qualitative side. So we've got additional issues with pollution and water quality. So that might be driven by mineral extraction, for example, tailings dam collapses, or the general difficulty that regulatory authorities have in managing polluters and holding them to account if they go above and beyond what they're actually allowed to do. The other thing I should mention here also is that I'm talking about water resource management generally, so all uses of fresh water, and I think you have to remember that that is the basis for water service provision generally. So if your water resource management framework is not very good, then it will be much more difficult to provide water services. And by water services, I mean for domestic use and for irrigation use, okay, because they'll all be part and parcel of that general water resource management framework. Okay, so if we think about the way that, I'm going to go into a bit more detail about how this works shortly, but broadly, if you look at international rivers, and especially rivers where there is no agreement. So a lot of my work recently is focused on South Asia. Excuse me. If you look at the likes of India and Bangladesh, for example, you have a situation where you've got two big rivers, the Ganga and the Brahmaputra. There's an agreement in the Ganges, which will run out very shortly. There's no agreement on the Brahmaputra, but those are both big rivers, and they have significant effects in all the riparian states. Now, if there is no agreement in place for an individual river or a basin, then the normal fallback, the automatic fallback, is the international legal standard, which is equitable and reasonable use. And that's encapsulated in the UN Water Courses Convention and also in the UNECE Water Courses Convention. Now, the thing to remember about this is, leaving aside if you've got an agreement or not, the general standard of equitable and reasonable use doesn't stay fixed. So what is equitable and reasonable one day or 1 year may not necessarily be the same the following in 5 years' time, for example. And that's partly because the way that the different factors are taken into account when you can try to determine what is equitable and reasonable, that changes over time. There is no hierarchy, accepted hierarchy for those factors that are set out in the Water Resources Convention. So it's not a fixed target. It changes. And that makes it more complicated. And even if you've got an agreement, very often agreements don't accommodate the idea that what is equitable and reasonable now may not be equitable and reasonable in 5, 10, 20 years' time. When you come up with these agreements, they tend to be in place for a long time. It's the same with national water legislation. So the consequence of that is that there is a danger that the law can get superseded by social realities, climatic realities, which we'll come on to. The other thing to say about that relationship between international legal frameworks and national ones is that in order for international legal frameworks to work, they're entirely dependent, almost always, on the extent to which countries can actually implement them. So if there's no alignment between what, for example, a midstream state will require a certain amount of water to come down from an upstream state, possibly under an agreement, possibly also using the general international legal standard. But it may also, it will also then have responsibilities in terms of how much water it passes on to downstream states. Now, that's very difficult to manage because it basically means that states have to know how much water is coming in and then know how much water is going out, also being able to control the pollution. So that's very difficult, and it's especially difficult for countries that are less developed and don't have the resources to be able to fund that kind of thing. Again, we'll come back to that. But it is also important to say that you might have additional problems at the national level because, so if we stay on the international rivers for now, it may well be that you've got an international river going through a state which is a federal state, in which case the individual federal states within that country most likely will have responsibility for managing their own water. And that makes it even more complicated to manage. So a state like Pakistan, for example, downstream on the Indus, but it has effectively a federal setup, and it's very difficult to manage that between the different states once the international river comes in there. Now, leaving aside the question of international rivers, not all rivers are international, not all are shared. You can have conflict between different areas, as I mentioned, in terms of federal states, but you can also have conflicts between sectors, the sectors we mentioned already and Pavel's already alluded to. If the water allocation that each sector is given is not working or is inequitable for whatever reason, very often countries will favor sectors which are most relevant for economic development, for example, or economic generation of income. So that can cause problems, and the environment as a sector there is almost invariably the last on the list and most likely to get badly affected. You can also have intersectoral problems. Are maybe not countries are not able to set up appropriate dispute resolution fora that can deal with that. So we talked about law mainly. I'm not really going to talk about policy, unless I'm happy to answer questions on that. But more on the institutional side, because water is cross-cutting, it makes it more difficult for countries to deal with the kind of things that they see in international agreements, especially in relation to quantity and quality. Very often, the relevant ministries for water quantity will be different from the one for water quality. So you might have a distinction between a Water Resources Ministry, for example, for quality, and then a Ministry of Environment, which might deal with quality. As soon as you introduce terms like sustainability and climate change into this, it gets even more complicated. And that's because, again, sustainability and climate change are, especially in terms of adaptation, are cross-cutting. So you're not going to have a single ministry which is responsible generally for either of those things. And so the relationship between water, sustainability, climate change more broadly starts to become really fragmented across national and more local ministries and departments. The other thing that climate change makes more difficult for national legal frameworks is the fact that what we've seen in the past is not really now any guarantee of what we're going to see in the future. So water management very often relies on historic data, but the idea of non-stationarity throws a spanner in that, because effectively it says you can no longer rely on using old historic data because the system has changed fundamentally and therefore it's no longer appropriate. That has impacts for allocation of water and makes it more complicated. I've also mentioned here the idea about adaptation. Very often what you see in this is another element where flooding generally is there may be a disaster ministry, but generally the organizations that deal with flooding will be local organizations. And that again causes difficulties, partly because the way that flooding is incorporated into national kind of water use allocation frameworks is not often very clear. Some countries do it better than others. And then the final point I'm going to make there is just to bear in mind that when we're talking about climate change, climatic change itself is only one of the factors that we're concerned about, because actually the response that society makes to those impacts is likely to have a very significant impact on longer-term resilience and the extent to which countries remain vulnerable. If they make them than not, and it's more difficult for them to try and pull themselves out of that. I've got a chart here very, very briefly. I just want to talk about this. If you look at the different reports, if you look at the Water for Peace fact sheet, for example, for World Water Day, it talks about 20% of countries having agreements in place that cover all of their shared waters. Now, that's a particularly negative way of looking at it. The chart here came from an SDG report that came out last year. And what you can see there is the proportion of transboundary basin areas with an operational arrangement in place for transboundary water cooperation. Now, that's what SDG 6.5.2 requires. But you'll see there that if you look at the details, the chart's a bit, what would we say, economical with the truth, because it only goes up to 70% on the x-axis. It doesn't go up to 100. The reality is that top bar is saying only 58% of the proportion of transboundary basin areas are covered by an operational agreement for cooperation. Now that is much lower for transboundary aquifers. There's really only about 4 or 5 agreements on transboundary aquifers, maybe 6. And transboundary rivers and lakes is still only 64%. So it's quite low, which means that and there's a big difference between the quality of some of those agreements. Some are much better than others. Okay, so I just want to bear that in mind, that that's the position, certainly that we were at in 2020. There isn't a more up-to-date chart for that currently, or figures for that. So again, I'm conscious of the fact that I think probably most of you are not lawyers. So again, maybe I need to be clear about exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about water use rights. not talking about water ownership. I'm talking about the way that countries apportion the rights for people to use water. Okay, so water law, in its basic essence, is determining who gets what water, how much of it, what's the quality of that water, and when are they entitled to get it. And from our perspective, from a climate change angle, it also apportions how the burden of hardship is shared. So whether it's droughts, are there particular focuses nationally that will be protected, so whether it's agriculture or the environment or drinking water. Drinking water generally is at the top because people who drink water also vote. But that will differ between jurisdictions. Countries allocate those rights using a number of different approaches. And the post-colonial legacy often is that countries have had systems imposed on them, which were appropriate in the, if you like, the old country, but not in the countries that have been colonized. And that does not help things. So normally those are based on property rights, which doesn't really bear any relation to environmental requirements or sustainability requirements. There may also be customary systems in there as well, which tend to relate to more localized systems, so more localized uses. But the relationship between customary systems and national ones can be problematic. Again, another potential source of conflict, which, if properly managed, it should not be a source of conflict. I've also mentioned IWRM, your Integrated Water Resource Management, and the idea that, in theory, countries are supposed to be applying integrated water resource management that combines the management of surface and groundwater, combines the management of water quantity and water quality, and then also takes account of upstream and proper account of upstream and downstream uses. From a developing country perspective, that's very difficult. It's difficult even in developed countries because it's very expensive and the data may not be in place to allow that to happen. IWRM is supposed to be a self-improving system, and so in theory it should be able to take account of, the legal framework should be able to take account of changes in or problems, maybe it's changes in resource availability, maybe there have been climatic changes over a shorter term, maybe there are new uses that have appeared on the basin that have not been recognized, and so the often variation and review processes will allow that to be taken into account, but that again is a big ask. And then finally, implementation and enforcement of laws, generally speaking, in relation to freshwater use, is much more difficult in poorer countries. The poorer you get, the more difficult it becomes. And also that relationship between developing countries and vulnerability to climate change also doesn't help. And so national water law frameworks are being asked to do quite a lot now, and they have additional challenges in terms of their capacity to not only deal with the resources that they have currently, but also to try and accommodate the changes that are coming with climate change. So countries are seeing that already, and it's a challenge. How are we for time? So, okay, I'm probably just about 2 minutes. Is that right, Pavel?
Yeah, it's okay. Please continue.
Okay. Good. Okay, thank you. So we have these issues with the ability of national legal frameworks to deal with changing circumstances that we're seeing in relation to climate change, whether it's less water falling, whether it's increased focus on storage, for example, which is becoming more important. And well, it may also be that the mechanisms for incorporating new science and the views of different stakeholder groups becomes problematic. So, for example, if I talk about policy very quickly, in terms of development of policy, one of the mistakes that some countries make is by getting everybody in the room and just saying, okay, let's get all the priorities together, and then we'll produce a policy which incorporates all of those views. The net result of that is that there isn't really a clear direction, and lots of stakeholders have different views on how to approach things. They may have fundamental disagreements about involvement of the private sector, for example, or the protection of the environment. And if you don't have a way of dealing with those in policy development, then the policy is likely to be ineffective. Lawyers tend to see law as one of the ways in which policy can be implemented. It's only one of those ways. There are different ways, but if there's a lack of reconciliation between what the policy wants and what the law can provide, then again, it's going to be more difficult to deal with that. So all of this creates some degree of uncertainty. And from my perspective, not as somebody who's an expert on peace or conflict, uncertainty can lead or is more likely to lead to problems than certainty. And if you've basically set up a system where it's all very clear what's happening, there's some degree of flexibility at the local level to take account of local circumstances, that would hopefully be better than a system where it's really not clear what decisions are going to be made because the legal framework is not clear enough. Now, the other thing that causes problems for the implementation of national legal systems is one of the things that Pavel's already alluded to in terms of gauging stations. So if you've got a monitoring network which is really not very good, then it's going to be much more difficult to understand what the situation is in a particular basin. But from an enforcement perspective, it also makes it more difficult because you may not have the degree of evidence that you need in order to prove your case. And if you're an environmental regulator who is reliant on criminal law sanctions, that's a big problem because it means it's much more difficult for you to enforce it. I should say, however, that there's a distinction here between the data that's needed in order to set up the appropriate legal framework and the data that's needed in order to ensure that that legal framework works properly. The first one, legal frameworks can be set up without having vast amounts of data. So we don't need to have the data first before we set up the network. As long as it's clear what the objectives of the legal framework, not the network. As long as it's clear what the objectives of the legal framework are, you can basically use that as a basis for identifying what data you need and then setting up the appropriate frameworks, the appropriate networks to do that. But you don't need the data in order to have establish your baseline. You can do it without that. Complications in fully applying IWRM, we've kind of touched on that already, but one of the things that is particularly problematic for developing countries is all of those conjunctive management issues, which I talked about, and the question of how do they incorporate public interest into what are effectively private rights. So how do we incorporate environment, equity more generally, sustainability, the rights of future generations, etc. Those are much, much more difficult to incorporate into licensing, for example. And that is problematic because, again, it reduces the predictability of the system. Where a system is predictable and hopefully fair, then there's much less likelihood of things going wrong. Okay, and I've also mentioned your vulnerability, but we've kind of talked about that already. Okay, so solutions. So solutions are difficult here. So we have this situation where national legal frameworks are being asked to do many different things, implement international agreements, deal with climate change and global change more generally, deal with a moving target in terms of what they need to achieve. and also do all the things that the SDGs want them to do. So that's difficult. And if we say, well, what we need to do then is set up legal frameworks which are brilliant and do all the things that they should do, we run the risk of hitting the South African problem. And the South African problem is they set up a brilliant system in 1997, but the funding and actually enforcing it, implementing it, has taken much, much longer. So even now, 27 years after it came into law, it's not implemented. It's slowly being implemented, but it does take a long time. So my suggestion is that maybe there is a way of coming up with a system which is maybe not perfect, but gets things started with a view to improving things over time. And the next point I've made is a bit more controversial for a lawyer, because lawyers tend to think that if you put the right law in place, it will work out great. In reality, gauging is a much bigger priority than it maybe is, because it undermines everything. I think also that getting as many people involved in the development of these kind of governance frameworks is crucial, but there has to be some, everybody can get what they want. There needs to be clarity over that, and hopefully that will undermine the potential for conflict, because people have to accept that maybe they don't get exactly what they want, but the broad direction of travel is good. I think it's critical that law doesn't get left behind by science or society. I don't know which jurisdictions you're all part of, which countries, but talking to people from the developing world generally, there is a feeling that law sometimes gets left behind because it doesn't ever change. And it needs to be adaptive enough to take account of changing circumstances, whether it's social or climatic, in a way that means it's not redundant. And then finally, that's going to need a lot of money. And so who's going to provide it? The developed countries have not been fabulous at providing money for SDGs generally, for climate change adaptation generally. All of that is problematic. And the timescales we're looking at now suggest that it needs to be much more urgent. So finally, I'm sorry, I've gone on too long, Pavel. I think climate change is likely to increase at the national level or the international level across sectors as well. And we have a number of different things going on globally in terms of development of human rights and water, the increasing importance of the environment, etc. So all of these create pressure, and where there's pressure, there's more chance of conflict if it's not addressed. I think that the idea of stakeholder processes, I mean, this has been done all over the world, so there's plenty of experience for how to get stakeholders involved effectively, and then continue to keep them involved. But there has to be care taken to ensure that equity is always included in this. I think overall minimizing uncertainty. There's a theory that states are obligated to cooperate with each other, and that this is the basis for more agreements being made. The reality, I think, I'm a bit skeptical of that. But I think for states to actually establish proper systems for the management of their water, that is more likely to lead to agreements across basins, because there'll be a degree of credibility that will start to adhere to that, and other states are more likely to be happy with that. I'm going to leave it at that, but thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for this wonderful presentation. Always very inspiring, interesting when I listen to your talks. And it's always very interesting to see the perspective of a lawyer in our hydrological environmental scope, the bubble. So it's a very refreshing, I must admit that. I think we can now address one question before going to the next presenter. And I believe the question that Diana asked, thank you, Diana, for being with us. It's a nice point also to conclude, to finish your presentation. Diana asks, can you share examples of successful collaborations between different stakeholders, governments, NGOs, local communities, in managing water resources for peace?
Okay, thank you, Diana. That's a difficult question. If I can take a step back, and I hope this answers your question, although it might not answer it directly. The successful collaboration, so that the way that collaborations work between stakeholders generally, and let's say governments, is not necessarily always aimed at keeping the peace. So I think that the assumption often is made, and the assumption that I've made to the presentation is, if you have successful collaboration, then peace will be a consequence of that, but it may not be the objective. So for example, in Scotland, so I'm in Scotland now. The way that the cooperation between government, for example, and stakeholders has happened is that there is a list of stakeholders which is put in legislation, and it basically lists all of the most relevant stakeholders who can get involved in consultations, etc. It doesn't include them in decision making, but hopefully it means that the right people are involved in the development of resource management planning. We haven't had any words about that in Scotland so far, but we have plenty of water, so it's easier. I'm trying to think of examples in a different setting. I mean, there are kind of best practice ideas rather than particular countries. Can I ask you which country you're from, Diana? Maybe you can put that in the chat. I think one of the things that sometimes happens is that the Venezuela. Okay, so my knowledge of Venezuela is very limited. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know. My leaving aside the kind of Scottish answer, I think I would say there are best practice principles for this, and the OECD has done this. Okay, so the OECD has water governance principles, engagement principles. I don't have them here currently, but I'll put up the link in the chat when we're done. And those are, I think, helpful.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, very much. I mean, I expected that it's very difficult, but in other way, it also means that there is a plenty job for us in future. Yeah, to bring those positive examples. It can motivate us better. So now I would like to thank you once again, and now I would like to bring here on stage our second speaker, Dr. Wakjira Takala Dibaba from Jimma Institute of Technology from Ethiopia, who will share his perspective on water resources, peace and prosperity. And now the screen is yours, Wakjira. Please share the screen.
Is it visible now?
Yes, it's perfect. Can start.
Thank you, Dr. Paul, for having me on this special World Water Day. I will be some integrated. I will talk on Ethiopian experience and best initiatives that we are having with respect to the watershed management. The contents of my presentation will be introduction, some challenges, Ethiopian development challenge and the prospect, the need for river basin management, Green Legacy Initiative as part of integrated water resource management. The links to sustainable development goals will be included in my presentation. As an introduction, maybe transboundary water rivers or lakes or aquifers are river systems or water systems that are really connecting two or more countries. And in the world, there are about 263 lakes and transboundary river basins, out of which almost 60, which accounts for 60% of the world freshwater flows. However, the two-thirds of the transboundary river actually is reported as lacks cooperative management framework when it is seen from the world aspect. Coming to Africa, in Africa, boundary river basins, which almost accounts for 64 of the continent's land and surface water resource. And almost these transboundary river basins in Africa actually are areas where 7% of the continent's population is actually found. More also, from the 63 transboundary river basins in Africa, almost only 14 major river basins have some kind of cooperation, legal or institutional arrangement where some kind of certain degree of responsibility is shared for the natural resource. Then what are the challenges now, maybe from the world and in everywhere, what are the challenges related to the transboundary river basin management? These transboundary river basins are complex due to the following reason. One, the multi-purpose nature and basin-wide location of these river basins and the involvement of many more actors are maybe one reason for the challenges to have management, best management. The difference in legal framework along the nations and nationalities, the historical and cultural background is, and also the difference in technical capability of the states owning the rivers are also some of the factors. Upstream and downstream conflict, as my previous presenter also mentioned, this upstream downstream conflict is not related to the sovereign countries, but also in the inter, that means among the problem. Lack of the mutually agreed water sharing mechanism is also one big among different regions are also the challenges that we are having currently in transboundary river basin management. At the same time, as a result of the human-induced changes and the nature of climate change from the global to regional variation, dealing with variable water in time and space is actually one big challenge currently. However, when it is seen in terms of maybe country, this East Africa, especially Northeast Africa, are facing severe challenges for these transboundary river basins. Why is it a big challenge in East Africa? Maybe the resources, most of the developing countries are dependent on natural resource. And these natural resources are under pressure because of the need to have increased agriculture, to have more farmlands, and the power required to maybe for the modernization, for building infrastructure, all the things actually require power, which also puts these river basins and water resources in East Africa under pressure. Sometimes it's also seen that water are used also as a political tool. The increasing economic value of water in all competing users, the relationship between the neighboring countries, the most importantly, the way we are utilizing resources, sometimes inappropriate utilization of resource and inadequately recognizing, identifying the potential resources that is residing in East Africa and not opening for collaboration actually, and underutilization of the resources are the big challenge that are seen in East Africa. Also, lack of proper understanding and lack of common institution and trust are the most common problem. For example, if I can mention simple example, the who trusts the data that is produced by one region, and then the other may not sometimes have a good trust on the data that is reported as an output from the other. You can mention different countries in this aspect. And the vulnerability of the region also is increased to the water scarcity in terms of quantity and the quality are also becoming highly vulnerable in East Africa. And Ethiopia is amongst one which is vulnerable to this water scarcity in this regard. What are the challenges in Ethiopia? Maybe the resources have played a minimal role in development in the past, as maybe forced to prioritize water resource development and the need, as a result, the need to utilize the increasing demand to utilize these resources are increasing. Sometimes the political instability and the nature of the hydrology for the water resource in Ethiopia are really complex, and the transboundary nature of the rivers. That means most of the river basins that we have as Ethiopians are transboundary by nature, and the increasing vulnerability to severe hydrometeorological events and weak adaptive capacity to climate shocks. And more than half of the population has no electricity, and there are also a need to have power on the other hand to transform agriculture through mechanization. Actually, mechanizing agriculture requires power. Now, to alleviate this issue, these problems for Ethiopians, water resource development is an essential to overcome the development challenges that I mentioned previously, but also to improve the electricity, to improve the national income, and also to accelerate the structural transformation of the economy are maybe some of the most important issues related to water resource development in Ethiopia. Ethiopia's ideological standpoint in this water resource development is to provide the society with a shared vision of Ethiopian prosperity and progress towards development through water resource development through the different mega projects. In this aspect, the failure to use its water is perceived as a blow to national identity and prestige. For this purpose, maybe currently water resource development has become the symbol of Ethiopian nationalism and renaissance. Even during the hard times, we currently Ethiopians are coming, maybe we are considering this water resource development as a symbol for the country renaissance, for the development, again, for the unity of its state and population. In this aspect, maybe when I say the transboundary nature of the river basins, of course, Ethiopia has 12 river basins. Majority of these transboundary river basins, which shares, for example, from the map, you can see the Baro, Akobo, Abai, and Tekeze contribute to the Abai, to the Nile basin, and Omo-Gibe basin contribute to Lake Turkana, which is found in Kenya. Gannale Dawa and the Wabishabele drains to the Somalia, and of course, two river basins, wet river basins are internally closed. So from the map, it can easily be observed that most of the potential rivers that Ethiopia have directly flows to the neighboring country. And almost majority of the rivers that Ethiopia is having is draining to the neighboring country. In this aspect, maybe if it is important, it can show you maybe how much these river basins are contributing. The first two, Abai, which is the local name of Upper Blue Nile, contributes about 54.5. And the next, Baro Akobo. And surprisingly, these two major river basins are draining to the Nile basin, to Sudan and then to Egypt. And also Tekeze through the Atrabara from the upstream will also contribute to this Nile basin. The others, Omo-Gibe River Basin is also directly contributing to the Kenya. And the rivers or the river basins that are closed within the country are maybe here, as it can be seen from the diagram, have minimum flow in Ethiopia. But the challenges that we are having in Ethiopia is most of the rivers, the big rivers that Ethiopians are having, have no continual or big flow during the dry time. So the only option for Ethiopians to use these river basins is to store when these rivers are at peak. As you can see, these river basins are at peak when during the rainy time in Ethiopia, June, July, August. So that means these flows are not available throughout the time. So the seasonality nature of the flows with the big rivers in Ethiopia are actually the challenges, and that has brought Ethiopians to build storage dams to store when this flow is at a peak. Otherwise, the chance to use these water resources during dry time is very less, and it is very minimal, as you can see from the photo. There are severe water competitions resulting from the inter and intra users, sectors, and the countries, and as a result, conflicts are becoming maybe sometimes from the upstream to downstream. Issues are increasing. The incidence of flares in quantity and severity is also increasing in most of the river basin. This clearly shows not as an option, but as a must to have management of river basins as it becomes maybe subjected to maybe scarce and competition is really increasing in the region. So what are the options in terms of managing these rivers or river basins? Maybe managing the competing uses through setting the priorities. One big question that has to get answered under this is actually how much water is available for use, and at the same time how much of it can be used for protecting the environment. These are the questions that has to be answered when setting the priorities. For instance, we can mention we need water for drinking. At the same time, we also need water for food production. We need water maybe to increase the crop yield and the yield. We need to have a good irrigation system. At the same time, to provide power to the agriculture, modernization, mechanization, and also other power requirement and infrastructures, we need to have electricity. Not only these uses, but also the environment, the nature also requires water resource. So these are maybe the points that need setting priorities. In terms of the transboundary or different nations, encouraging multilateral cooperation with the resources are actually very important to alleviate the challenges and the conflicts that are currently arising. One mechanism to come with this is actually to promote cooperation beyond borders within the Caribbean countries and enhancing opportunity for economic integration. For instance, as Ethiopians are currently doing to provide water supply for Djibouti and for Somalia, at the same time providing electricity to some Sudan, to Kenya, and to other neighboring countries. So maybe making this East Africa region maybe as one for economic integration is one best important. Sharing what the others have and sharing the resources that actually the potentials that Ethiopians are having. Because when we look at the nature of the Ethiopian water resource, maybe the topographies are complex that actually suits to have multi-hydropower projects than compared to the other regions. Networking and committing to coordination and knowledge sharing among the countries, and also maybe from the global aspect with the provision of global knowledge networks are very important to solve the problems. Enhancing national development plans in all Caribbean countries and allowing local solutions to transboundary actions at the local region, and encouraging and sharing best experiences among the regions are some of the best solutions. With these best experiences, I will bring you to the point of the Green Legacy Initiative as part of integrated water resource management. What really integrated water resource management can be seen as the coordinated development and management of land and water resource for the upstream and downstream interest, but also for the surface water and groundwater management. In this regard, the Green Legacy Initiative brought by Prime Minister Dr. Abiy, planting our print for future generation, entails many benefits, as it is aimed to restore the overexploited and degraded natural resource, increasing the land cover by forests, which will help also to reduce soil and reservoir sedimentation, halting desertification and contributing to Ethiopia's effort in achieving sustainable goal of 2030. There are two ways which we can use to manage siltation in dams before it reaches a dam or after it reaches a dam. And the most feasible solution for countries like Ethiopia is managing silt before it reaches reservoir, because maybe after it reaches the dam, removing sedimentation is maybe not economical in terms of the country capacity. And this will provide a proactive approach to treat the causes of this soil erosion, which will help really to keep soil fertility, at the same time to sustain the water resource reservoirs that we are building in the country, at the same time also to combat some of the flooding and sedimentation issues into the downstream. The green legacy could be one which could be used to tackle sedimentation at the problem. In this regard, the green legacy can be considered as an excellent start for the silver bullet of the problems. Currently in Ethiopia, the best experiences show that sustainable natural resource conservation practice has become more of an art, even that everybody wishes to enjoy by visiting. As you can see, this is one simple demonstration that is built in one of the Ethiopian regions. And this is how mountains are really undergoing natural resource conservation. These structures are built with the aim of controlling soil erosion and maintaining surface runoff, which is actually the source of silt on the downstream. At the same time, the cause for soil fertility decline, which in turn is the cause for crop yield maybe decline through time, which is increasing, which is decreasing actually the farmer's profitability from the crop field. And these are actually currently the community of Ethiopia are accepting these management scenarios, especially as the ownership, and they are taking it as the only solution to really conserve areas that really requires restoration. And this is one simple example to show that. And practically, there are many evidences that are really showing these management initiatives are showing promising results before the management and after the management. And some simple examples that I can share to you is these pictures or this picture, which looks like this before in 2012, and it looks like like this in 2016. And this is actually near to the area where I'm living. How do these activities really contribute to the sustainable development goal? I can mention at least these three major components in which this Green Legacy Initiative have a big contribution. One, ensuring the availability and sustainable management of water for all, and taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impact, and protecting, restoring, promoting sustainable use of the terrestrial ecosystem, of course, which is a concept that is brought from developed countries like ecohydrology or nature-based solution to manage the terrestrial, aquatic, and urban areas can be considered as one which is contributing to this. Coming to the conclusion, maybe as it can be seen from the transboundary nature, maybe water knows no border, and transboundary cooperation is the key to secure water resource and also for the water security issue in terms of the economic value, for the quantity, and also the quality aspect. And water is a catalyst for all, and good basin management is the key to achieve this, unless maybe these resources can be subjected to different kinds of decline. And cooperation, creativity, and good management can really solve these issues. For example, finding solution like making ways by which you can really increase the productivity of water, and the modernizing the irrigation schemes can really solve to have maybe can help to bring this good management. For the success of this good management, and also for the key cooperation, actually good political will and participatory approach is very essential for success. And maybe in terms of mitigating and adapting climate change, irrigation management and modernization, water productivity are very important to manage these resources, freshwater resources, to manage the environment and water resource for the generations under the future changes of climate and other human-induced changes. And this is all. And thank you for having me on this. And if there are questions, I'm happy to interact.
Thank you, Dr. Dibaba, for this great presentation. I really enjoyed that, especially when you showed the positive examples, when you showed this way forward. I feel there is a lot of work in front of us, but there are many positive examples how we can do it, how we can achieve this sustainability. Regarding the questions, there are some questions on the chat, so now maybe we will move smoothly to this part of our meeting. So, staying with you in voice, the question for you was, what are the potential conflicts and disputes that arise from the utilization of Transbundari river basins in Ethiopia? And how can they be effectively addressed? So if you can take this one.
Okay. The challenge is actually in maybe as I mentioned in the beginning, the need to dominate on natural resources are actually the critical problem that are arising in East Africa. That is actually challenging. For this kind of scenario, maybe the agroecology sometimes suits some kind of development in one region, and again to develop some kind of development in other region. That's why I'm saying building a common maybe economic integration is actually a solution to really have cooperation to bring the ideas together and share experiences and solve the problems. But the issue here is who really trusts sometimes in most current time, who trusts the data that is built, maybe developed by, for example, Sudan? And what about the data that Ethiopians has developed? Can't really we can have a common institution that can really work for the integrated, maybe by considering all the regions together, and having the maybe economic integration is actually a good experience that can really solve these integrated the transboundary the issues. Not only the between the sovereign countries, unless it is managed properly, conflicts will arise even within a country with different states. Within the same country, maybe the upstream need to have irrigation and the downstream will also need to have irrigation. And the point comes, how can we maybe just, what solution can we really bring for these two countries to utilize properly their resources? Now, the issue is when the one maybe is saying, claiming it's a must, it is the right to use it dominantly. That is a big problem, and when the conflict begins. So the willingness to share and to avoid dominance on the one's resource is actually a good recommendation to alleviate that kind of problem.
Thank you, Dr. Yob. I think you also pointed the second question, which was regarding the coordination of Transbordari river basins in Ethiopia. But is there any specific unit institution that is responsible now in Ethiopia to deal with Transbordari waters?
Of course, there is a good beginning with the Nile Basin, which is called the Nile Basin Initiative, and its office is in East Africa. It is shared among the 11 countries. And the issue is, as I mentioned, sometimes the political will really matters here to give data and to share data and to make solutions. Because if it is not standing, if only scholars from one side is dominating that office and working only toward this one thing, and that's a problem. But there are organizations, and there is a good initiation that these Nile Basin countries have Nile Basin Initiative (NBI), which was not established recently, but it has been a long time. But how long is it really effective in resolving the conflict is matters, because some of the countries are going beyond that, and that's why I said there are sometimes the need to make it politicizing and bringing the idea to the other region. It's good to really maybe have a common ground as East Africa and establish some organization there to work on the solutions, on the common solutions actually are recommended. So there are an initiation for that, but how long is it effective is actually dependent on the political will of the sovereign countries.
Thank you for this one. Maybe at this point we'll go back to Andrew, if Andrew is still there, because there was some question from Ms. Gebu about the role. Oh, I mean, I will read the question. What role does water diplomacy play in resolving transboundary water disputes and fostering peace between nations? And how can international collaborations and partnerships promote sustainable management of water resources? I mean, again, probably we are going to some examples if you have them. Or if not, maybe you can tell us about some initiatives, ideas, and I don't know, examples again.
Okay, another tricky question. I mean, what role can hydrodiplomacy play? I think hopefully a positive role. In terms of examples where it's worked, it's a pity because the example that we've just heard about in Nile Basin Initiative is almost the opposite, because it's been going for so long and it still hasn't managed to bring all the parties together and agree, has it? So which is unfortunate. And I know that people have been putting a lot of effort into this for a long period of time. And the fact that the Common Framework Agreement didn't succeed, yeah, I suppose it just demonstrates how difficult the hydrodiplomacy is. I know that in South Asian context, the World Bank has been trying to strengthen the diplomatic efforts between the countries on the Brahmaputra, the SAWI, South Asian Water Initiative. But again, it's a very long-term effort. I mean, if I go back to the initial question about the successful stakeholder engagement, etc., one of the questions that almost has to be asked is, well, how do you measure success? Do you measure success in terms of all the stakeholders getting their views reflected in an agreement, for example, or is it, as international institutions often have it, based on the number of meetings that are had or some other factors? So measuring how you actually assess whether or not it's been successful or not is a separate question. In terms of other I suppose the other diplomatic success really has been on the Guarani aquifer, because that has led to successful development and application of the agreement on the Guarani. And as far as I know, those of you from South America will know better than me, that is progressing well. So whether or not it's a result of what you might call hydrodiplomatic efforts, I would say probably it has been. So yeah, it takes a long time. This takes a long time, especially at the international level. And despite the best interests of the best efforts of people involved, it's a very difficult challenge.
Thank you very much for addressing this. I mean, diplomacy in general is a very complicated field where you have to take under account a lot of things, number of things. And the second question to you, I mean, it's outside your field, but maybe you can address that also. Can every country have the right to access the resources found in the sea rather than using port and sea coasts? I mean, the coastline, I understand here. What international water law says about this?
Okay, so okay, I'm going to give you the lawyer's answer. It depends. So the first point, from the perspective of international water law generally only relates to fresh water. So it doesn't relate to the sea. and there are separate questions about what happens with salinization, for example, so desalinization, because it's becoming more popular, it's becoming cheaper, and I think countries are much more interested in using it as an option. On the face of it, it doesn't have any bearing on international water law because it's not fresh water. However, there are jurisdictions where coastal zones are included. So the EU, for example, so the EU Water Framework Directive, which notionally focuses on freshwater, also includes transitional waters, so estuaries and deltas, but also coastal waters. The coordination of coastal waters with freshwaters is sometimes more difficult, but there's at least it recognizes the fact that there is an interface between freshwaters and coastal waters. I don't think it relates to the impact of coastal waters on freshwaters, though. It's generally the reverse. So from a water law perspective, whatever happens in the sea is not relevant, generally speaking. It might be relevant for other aspects of environmental law, for example, or coastal zone management, and depending on where the brine is distributed after the desalinization process, there might be other questions about local agreements for. So, for example, in the North Atlantic, where I am, the OSPAR agreement deals with pollution from land-based sources. So, if the salt brine was regarded as a pollutant, then maybe it would fall foul of OSPAR rules that are then implemented at the national level. But generally speaking, not relevant for international freshwater law.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for this one. I believe we are going to finalize the meeting. I want to ask you, both of our speakers, do you want to use this time to have some final conclusion, remark, one sentence, take-home message to our listeners? Maybe, Andrew, you can start as you spoke just now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, back in 2022, and one of the objectives of the meeting that we were at, one of the abiding kind of objectives was to try and come up with a positive message, certainly from the legal side. And I wanted to try and reflect that, but it's a bit difficult. So what I talked about was slightly, I think, depressing, because I'm basically trying to add another element to a picture which is already difficult. But I do think that there's scope for national water legal frameworks to contribute to peace. And I think that people shouldn't just focus on the international side, because sometimes, so academics have a tendency to sometimes want to focus on the doom and the horror by saying, oh, but here's something else that's complicated and makes it more difficult, but then not really come up with a positive message. And my positive message is that legal frameworks at the national level can help. And it is possible to come up with a good framework. It doesn't have to take years and years and years, but we need to be able to recognize that that is the case and understand how it interfaces with the international level and where problems are coming from. I think is that good to come up with a positive message?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that finally we forced you to give us this positive.
Yeah. Sorry, miserable otherwise.
No, thank you. It was great. And then Wakjira, maybe you also would like to conclude.
Okay, thank you again. As it was explained also by Dr. Allan, the pressure by human-induced pressures and climate change are adding really an extra pressure risk to the natural resources, and also the need to use these natural resources are maybe increasing from many aspects. So to really manage this resource which is under pressure as a result of the need to utilize at the same time the other climate, which is maybe I can say maybe natural, and which is from the global to regional dynamic climate change is posing to these finite resources. It's a must to come to the table that really to share the experiences and point out ways to really manage this resource for the common development. Yeah, because everyone needs to use the resource, and the demands are increasing. But at the same time, to the need to develop, there has to be a need to conserve these resources. And the best experiences, for example, the Green Legacy Initiative in Ethiopia is now shared to the neighboring countries. For example, last year there was a plan that to share this plantation to Kenya, to Djibouti, and the other neighboring countries. So cooperation is required for the development at the same time for the management of the resources. And thank you. This is my final.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was really great to have you both here. I would like to say that on the chat we have additional questions that I think the best way will be to contact you. I mean, I'm talking now to Gadefa Fekadu, who asked the questions. With you, Wakjira, maybe I can send you the email of the member of the person, and then you can contact directly to answer the questions, because I can see that this discussion can continue, but we need to finish. I mean, I want to give you also time to celebrate World Water Day. Remember that we are part of a huge community of water enthusiasts, and I must say that with our group of IAHR, Polish chapter of this young professional network, we will organize further webinars, further meetings, and also, as I mentioned to you, with UNESCO HP, we are planning to inform you in the following days. So please stay in touch, and thank you once again for this wonderful celebration. Please continue it in your local communities, in your homes, and yes, stay in touch. Thank you very much once again.
Thanks very much, Pavel.
Thank you.
Thank you, and
Pavel.
stay
Thank you.
blessed.
Thank you.